Hashem, today's Daf Yomi is Menachos 19, but we're going to start on the bottom of 18b, 3 lines from the bottom. And we were having a dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon. Excuse me, not Rabbi Yochanan, the Rabbanan and Rabbi Shimon. And the Rabbanan are of the position that the pouring of the oil, the yitzika, which is actually the third time that the oil is poured on the mincha, that can be done that even by a non-Kohen. Whereas Rabbi Shimon is of the position that can only be done by a Kohen. So the Gemara now wants to know what's the basis for the Rabbanan's position. My time of the Rabbanan. So the Gemara says it's based upon the pasuk Amakra by Yitzok Oel Shemen and Nastan. It says the pasuk says V'Yatzak Oel Shemen v'Nastan Oel Levona, that you should pour oil on it and you should put the frankincense on it. V'Aviel b'nei Aaron HaKohen, and you bring into the children of Aaron the Kohen, the kamatz, and then you do the kamitza. And so that teaches us mikmitza ve'elach mitzvahs kahuna, that the mitzvah of the kahuna is only from the kamitza onward, and the kamitza is after the yitzika. We made a yitzika blila, as this teaches us about the yitzika, and the blila is actually before the yitzika. It's where you pour the second time the oil on, and you mix it with the flour, and it's kashera by a zar. That's even kosher by a non-kohen. So it's only from the kamitza onward that you require kahuna. Whereas Rabbi Shimon says, it says in the pasuk b'nei Aaron HaKohanim, that after the pasuk of the yitzika, then the very next pasuk states Lakach HaKohen, and then it states in the pasuk, it says in the very next pasuk, Ve'ivia b'nei Aaron HaKohanim. So Rabbi Shimon, on top of 19a, Rabbi Shimon's of the position, Mikra Nidrash L'fanav U'Acharav. And not only do we say that the part of the Kamitza requires the Kohanim, but we also read the verse backwards and read the action before it, which is the Yitzika, is also required by the Kohanim. You need a Kohen for the Yitzika. Gemara says, wait 1 second, we have a problem accepting this. V'savar Rabbi Shimon, Mikra Nidrash L'fanav U'Acharav. Is Rabbi Shimon really have this position that the verse was expounded before it and after it? Vatanya, but then we have a brisa that stated, the Kohen is supposed to take the blood of the sin offering in his finger and place it on the corners of the altar. So it was from the fact that it says and he does it with his finger. And then it also says vilakach, meaning to say that lakach needs to be, you read the lakach as saying that word came before be'etzba'o. It says in the pasuk lakach kol midam achatas be'etzba'o, but read it not just v'nasam, but also v'lakach, which is the taking. Melamed shalote kabbalah el biyamin. The word etzba'o means with the right. So it teaches us that the kabbalah, the lakach, has to be with the right hand. And then it says v'nasan melamed shalote netzina el biyamin, meaning to say the rabbis in that brisa read it backwards and forwards, whereas Amar Rabbi Shimon v'chinemar yad b'kabbalah doesn't say the hand by the receiving. Although lo nemar yad b'kabbalah, it doesn't say anything. L'akach doesn't say anything about a hand, and so therefore, kibo b'smol kosher. According to Rabbi Shimon, if you receive it in the left hand, it's kosher. And the Amar Abaye says, what are they arguing about? The core of their dispute has been nidrash l'fanav u'acharav kamifli. They're arguing about whether or not we say the verse is expounded backwards and forwards. Rabbi Shimon's of the position here that it's not expounded backwards. So how can you say Rabbi Shimon says that the reason why the Kohen is required is because he expounded the verse backwards and forwards? Ela hachataima. This is the reasoning to Rabbi Shimon. Gemara says we have to suggest a different reason why Rabbi Shimon says that only the Kohen can do the Yitzika. What's the basis for it? This is the reason for Rabbi Shimon. It says in the pasuk, V'heviyah al b'nei Aaron HaKohanim. After the Yitzika, it says, and it is brought to the Kohanim. V'heviyah, the extra vav mosif al inyan rishon. It's to say that it's adding on. This is brought to the Kohanim, and also the previous thing was brought. So that the vav is adding on. When Gemara says, well, if that's the case, el me'ata, it says, v'shachat es ben bakar v'krivu b'nei Aaron HaKohanim es adam. he shall slaughter the cattle, and the bnei Aaron the Kohanim shall bring the blood. The zarku es adam, and they shall sprinkle the blood, which means mikabola ve'elach mitzvahs kahuna. From the Kabbalah onward, it's a mitzvah of the kahuna. Melamed al shchita sheksher bazar. That this teaches us that the shchita, meaning it says you shall slaughter the cattle and then bring it to the Kohanim and they'll sprinkle the blood. So the Talmud Kama this brisa says, yeah, the shchita, the slaughter, can be done by the non-Kohen. It's only from the sprinkling onward, or the Kabbalah is it a mitzvah of the Kohanim. But the shchita is ksher by the zar. But if you're going to follow Rabbi Shimon's position, since it states v'hikrivu b'nei Aaron kohanim, so it's an extra vav mosifal in Yerishon. Since the vav of v'hikrivu is adding on, if that's the case, according to Rabbi Shimon, since the vav of Rabbi Shimon is of v'hikrivu is adding on, it should be shlita should also. You should also require a kohen for the slaughter. So the Gemara says, no, that case is different. There's a specific reason why the shlita is kosher by a non-kohen. The Amakra v'samach v'shachat, because it says in the previous pasuk that the kohen brings the non-kohen places his hands on the head of the oah. That's called the smicha. He places his hands. He says a confession or he says a prayer. And then it says v'shachat. So those two words are together. Tell us masmicha bazar mavshlita bazar. To tell us that they both can take place with the non-kohanim, both the smicha and the shlita. The Gemara says, well, no. If that would be the case, once you're comparing the smicha and the shlita, well, if that's the case, we should say just like the smicha has to be done not by the kohen, the confession can't be done by the kohen, but by the owner of the korban. So also the shlita should have to be done by the non-Kohen. It's not that the shlita can be done by the non-Kohen. Maybe it has to be done by the non-Kohen. Where it says no. That far we're not going to say because it's a kal v'chomer. Umaz the rika, just like the sprinkling of the blood, the ikar kapara, that's the essence of the kapara. Lo bai bawim. The owners are now required shlita to have ikar kapara. Shlita, which is not the most essential part. The slaughtering of the animal is not the core of the atonement. The core of the atonement is the sprinkling. Well, kol shekain, for sure, it should not require the owner. And if you want to say ain't done an avshar mishe'i avshar, and if you want to say no, don't. That's a weak kal v'chomer, because in the case of the sprinkling of the blood, it's impossible for the non-kohen to do it, and so therefore don't compare it to the case where it's possible for the non-kohen to do it, which is by the shlita. And if you want to suggest that, well, no, we're not going to say that because Gali Rachmana b'Yom Kippurim, the Torah specifies by Yom Kippur that the owner has to do it. As it states, v'shachat es parachatat asher lo, that the Kohen Gadol has to slaughter his own bull. And from the fact that it says by Yom Kippur, the owner has to do it, i.e. the Kohen Gadol, we call the Shlita Ba'alma will be in Ibam. In that case, it's required, but in general, it's not required. So now the Gemara has a statement of Rav. Amar Rav called Malcolm Shenemar. Really, the question is, what's it even doing here? And it's got to go backwards, because we were talking in our Mishnah about those aspects which were essential by the mincha. So the Gemara is going to eventually get to that here. So the Gemara says, Amarav, kol makom shenemar Torah v'chuka, wherever it says the words Torah and chuka in the Torah, einu el lakev. It means that the matter that's being discussed is an absolute requirement, and if it's not done, it's disqualified. Gemara's assumption says of Rav's statement, Kosaka Daitoch, the assumption about what does Rav mean is Tarti Be'ina. We need both Torah and Chukah. K'dechsev, as it states, Zot Chukata Torah. It says this is the laws of the Torah. Gemara's assumption is that in order for it to be essential, you require both. And now the Gemara is going to raise 7 questions against that. And the siman, the way to remember it, is Natatz Yakmal. Gemara says, what are you talking about? First question, Nazir, by the word, by the Nazarite, only the word Torah appears. The Amarav, Tenufa ben Nazir Ma'akevet, that you have to do a waving by the Nazir. You have to wave, that you have to do the waving by the Nazir. And so we see from here, where it says in the Torah, you have to Zroa b'shelem and ayel v'chal matzachas, and you put the loaves on the hands of the Nazir, and the Kohen waves it. So we see from here that the waving is required, even though it only says, excuse me, according to Rav, it's required, even though it only says Torah. Shani also, no, that case is different. Kivin d'chsiv ken yaseh Command chukah. Now, since it says there, thus you shall do, it says though it says chukah. Gemara says, what about the Toda? The second question. I already told the Thanksgiving offering. The Lok Siva Bay El Torah. It only says Torah. And Tanan Arba Shabbat Ma'achman. It says the Toda has 4 different types of bread. And if you only brought 3 of them, it's not acceptable. So they're all required. And it doesn't say Torah. And it doesn't say Chukah there. So the Gemara says Shani Toda. Again, the Toda is different. The Iskish Nazir, because it's comparable to the Nazir. Al Zevach Toda Shlamav. V'amar Shlamav Rabbo Shalmei Nazir. And so that includes the Nazir, and the Toda is compared to the Nazir. V'arei Mitzorah. What a third question. What about the Mitzorah? The Siv Be'el Torah. It doesn't say Chukah. It only says Torah. But Tanan Arba Minash of Mitzorah. Ma'achim Zetzeh. The 4 parts of the Mitzorah are all essential. What are the 4 parts? The cedar wood, the crimson, the Eitzer, the Shnitulas, the Azov, the Hyssop, and the Tziporim, and the 2 birds. So you need all 4 parts. Again, Shani Asan, the Mitzorah is different. Kivin Dachsiv, Zostia, Torah, Mitzorah. And it says, this shall be the laws of the Mitzorah. Command Dachsiv, Chukah. It says, though it says Chukah. 4th question, Varayom Kippurim. Okay, now, the Bayom Kippur, it only says Chukah. Right? Vinasan, Vitanana, we learned Shnei Sirei Yom Kippurim. You need both goats. So Gemara says, okay. Ela o Torah o Chukah. You need either one in order for it to be essential. And the Gemara says, what are you talking about, Vare? 5th question. Shar karbanos, all other sacrifices. D'chsivu Torah. It says the word Torah by all other sacrifices. How does it say the word Torah? What does it say? It says Zos HaTorah lo mincha chatas Hashem Hashem. So it says the word Torah by all of them. Shar karbanos d'chsivu Torah v'lo ma'akvei. And not all the parts of the are essential. Rashi says, what are we talking about? They're not all essential. Because it says in the first chapter, we learned by the Ashem, who atzmo shaluturi imur of kosher. By the Ashem, if the imurim were not brought to Ashem, it's still kosher. And by the Mincha, we learned all these things in our Mishnah about the things that are not required, like the Agasha, for example. So the Gemara says, Torah by a chukah will by Torah. The word Torah requires chukah in order for it to be a requirement, but chukah does not require Torah. So the fact that it says Torah by the Karbanos doesn't mean that it's required because it doesn't say chukah. Gemara says, but that's not what Rav said. But Torah of the chukah kamar. Rav said both of them. It says are needed to make it essential. So the Gemara says, this is what Rav meant. Torah, even though it says the word Torah, iksiva chukah, if it would say the word chukah, it will be required view logo. Gemara says, wait, 6th question. V'harei mincha, and this comes from our Mishnah. Tichsiv ba chukah, it says the word chukah. V'amar Rav kol makom shehichsir akasav b'Torah mincha enu el la'akev. And Rav says wherever the Torah repeats itself by the mincha, it's a requirement, and that means to say hichzir in lo hichzir lo. Only if it repeated. It doesn't matter if it says chukah. The only reason why it's a requirement is because it was repeated. So the Gemara says no. Shani also in the case of the mincha is different. It's relating to something specific, i.e., the eating of the shirayim, and so therefore the word chukah is not meant to be ma'akev, to be required. Gemara now comes to the 7th question. Vare lechem aponim, the bread on the table. The ksiva chukah achil ksiva. There, the word chukah is written on the eating. Mitzanan shnei sidar ma'akvan zetzeh, shnei bezdikim ma'akvan zetzeh, asidar ma'bezdikim ma'akvan zetzeh. And there, we do see that the different parts of it are required. The columns, each one is a ma'akev. It's a requirement for the other one to have both the bezdikim, the spoons, and the frankincense. So we see that even though we sit on the achila, it's still ma'akev. So why is it not ma'akev by the mincha? What's the rule here? So the Gemara says, El kol hechad ksiva achila akua milsa ksiva. So really, wherever it says the chukah, the word chukah on the achila, it really refers to everything. Meaning to say, and everything should be ma'akev. So if that's the case, why is the mincha not ma'akev? But shani hasam, But by the mincha, even though it says chukah, it's not going to be required. Amakra mi girso mi shamna, because the pasuk says Viktira kohen esaskar. So I shall bring the mincha offering mi girso mi shamna. From the girso is the fine flour, and the shamna the oil. Al kol vonasa, which means that the pasuk is emphasizing on top of 19b. Garis v'shemen ma'akvin ve'in davar achar ma'akvin. By the mincha, what's required? The flour and the oil, but not the other parts. So in summary, wherever it says Torah by itself, don't say that it's essential. Even though by a Nazir and a Todah Mitzorah, it's essential, that's, in general, you can't learn it. But the second thing is wherever it says Chukah by itself, that is essential. And even though it's written just about the Achila, we say it's essential. But by the Mincha, the reason why not every part is essential is because it's specifically from the Girso, Mishamna, the flour and the oil. And for sure, where it says Torah and Chukah together, for sure it's essential. Okay, now we're up to the statement that we saw before that Rav said. Gufa, we learned earlier. Gufa, Amarav, Kol Mokum Shehichziocha, Kosav Torah's Mincha, Eino El Akiv. That Rav says, and we had this law also by Karbonos in general, wherever the Torah repeats itself by Mincha, it's to tell us it's a requirement. Shmuel Amar, Garis V'Shem Ma'akim Ve'in Davar Achim Ma'akim. Shmuel says, no, the only thing that's requirement by the Mincha is the flour and the oil, but not anything else. And so the Gemara says, well, Shmuel, Afagav the Tanam Beikra, so according to Shmuel, even though the pasuk repeats it, the word Tana means Shana. Even though the pasuk repeats it by the Mincha, you're going to say it's not requirement. Is that not the case? So it can't be. Shmuel says really wherever the pasuk repeats it, it's for sure a requirement. What are Shmuel and Rav arguing about? They're arguing about the following brisa. About melokum tzo bikum tzo. What does that mean? Because it says in the pasuk, the Tanya we learned in the brisa, it says by the law of the kmitza, the kamat misham melokum tzo. The kohen should scoop from the mincha a scoop of flour. And there's different pasuk. It says ve'irimi menu bikum tzo. So there's a change in the language. So this teaches us shelo yaseh mida l'komet. So he has to scoop it with his hand, and he can't do it with a utensil. And that is what Rav and Shmuel are arguing about. Rav Savar Hanami Tana Bekra. This idea that the kmitza has to be not in a utensil was repeated because it says by the miluim. It says he brought the mincha and he filled up his hand. So we see his hand and not the utensil. Shmuel says, Doros Mishal Yafina. No, that by the Milum was a one-time moment. So we can't learn from it for all future generations. And so therefore, Shmuel would say if you use the utensil, it would not be ma'akiv. You're supposed to use the utensil, but if you didn't do it, then it wouldn't be disqualified. If you use the utensil, it wouldn't be disqualified. The Gemara says, so then the Gemara has just a side point. Shmuel doesn't learn out future laws from the momentary law, from the law of the Miluim. And this we add at the end of Zivachim. The utensils that hold liquid, mikachin, and salach. If you put in them a liquid item in the temple, they could sanctify it. Midas yavish, the measuring utensils for dry, mikachin as the yavish, and you put something dry in it, it will sanctify it. The ain kriyalach mikachin as the yavish, will midas yavish mikachin as salach, and the utensils for liquid will not sanctify the dry, and the dry utensils, the measuring dry, will not sanctify the liquid. B'amar Shmuel, lo shnan, Shmuel says, when do we say this law? Only about midos, only about the measuring utensils. Of a mizrakos, but if it would be a basin, meaning to say only about the measuring utensils that are dry. That the liquid utensil not sanctify the dry one. We only learned this about the moist, the liquid measuring utensils. like to measure the hin and the lug, because since it wasn't, those utensils were never anointed, like they were only anointed for the purpose of measuring liquid, and so therefore they can't measure dry, and so therefore it doesn't sanctify. Of a mizrakos, but the basins, which are in themselves inherently sanctified because they're used to hold the blood, mikachin, they can be mikadesh the yavesh. And what's the source for that idea of dichsev shnehem moyem soas? Because it says by the gifts of the Nisiim that the mizrakos were filled with flour. And so anyway, Shmuel is learning out from here, from the moment of the Miluim for future generations. So you learn out from Sha'al Adoro. So the Gemara says, no, that case is different. There, the reason why you can learn out that the Mizrakos can sanctify is not because it happened at that time, but it's because it was repeated 12 times. The Nisim passage is read every single day. Why is it repeated? Shani Asam, the Tana Bekar, Tracers, or Zimnin. And what's the reason why it's repeated 12 times? It teaches this idea that utensils that held liquid but we're not measuring utensils, can indeed sanctify the dry items that were put in there. The Gemara says another question. How could Rav say, whenever the Torah repeats something by a mincha, it's to say its requirement? So Amalei Rav Kahana, Rav Atziel, Rav, Vare Agasha. What about Agasha? The Tana Bekra, that's repeated. What's the Agasha? That's where you're supposed to take your mincha to the flour, after the flour is mixed with the oil. Before the kamitza, you take it and touch it to the corner of the altar. There were some rebbes who they said, since our challah on Shabbos corresponds to the mincha, before they would make hamotzi, they would take the challah and touch it to the table to remind us of the mincha, of the agasha. Now, agasha, the Tanam Bekra, for the pasuk repeats it, and the agasha is not required. So the Gemara says, no, that's what Rav says. But Matana Bey, who is the one who says, Matana Bey, where is it repeated? That pasuk where it's repeated, that you're supposed to bring them close, is not actually a repetition. That's just to tell us where the agasha takes place. It's not telling us the din of Hagasha, but it's telling us what part of the altar. The Tanya. So Hagasha is not really repeated, and that's why it's not required. The Tanya, it says in the pasuk, "Akrivasa b'nei Aaron b'nei Hashem." So what do we do? And this one we had this Gemara we also had in. If you remember, we had it in Zvachim Samach Gimel. Then it says, with Nei Hashem Yachol b'Ma'irav. I might think that the mitzvah of Agasha is on the western side of the altar, meaning the side closer to the Beis Hamikdash, just closer to the sanctuary. It needs to be opposite the altar, on the southern side, facing the altar. I might think it's on the southern side. That's before Hashem. So okay, said. So what do? Magisha b'karen jormas ma'arabis. You need both before Hashem and facing the altar. So you bring it to the southwestern corner, keneged chudash al karen, opposite the corner of the horn. Vidayo, and that's sufficient. That's the position of the Tanakhama. But Rabbi Eliezer Omer Yachol. So that's why Rav says that pasuk is not repeated, because Lefnei Hashem teaches us where the mincha goes. Rabbi Eliezer argues, V'omer Yachol Yagishen L'Marava Shal Karen, and with Jorma Shal Karen, I might think that you bring it to the west and also the south, or also the south. Different ways of reading it. Amras Kol Makom Shatam Mosei Shtei Mikros, wherever you find two psukim, and Echam Mekayim Atzmo Mekayim Chaver. One of them, it's possible to read and to fulfill its meaning and also its friend's meaning. But one of them, if you read it that way, negates the other one. You take the reading which allows for more expansive applications, and that doesn't contradict the verses. When it says Lefnei Hashem, which is in the west, you canceled the southern part. Bedarim canceled Lefnei Hashem. So therefore, So therefore, you have to do, but Lifnei Hashem can also be on the southern part. It's not just the western part, but Lifnei Hashem can also be the southern part. So the Gemara says, "Ve'echa kamaisa." Well, how does that work? That you're doing Lifnei Hashem if it's on the southern part. It's just facing the altar, but it's not opposite the base of Mikdash. The Gemara says, no, you can do it. Remember, we had this in Zvachim. Amar Avashi, we had this in Zvachim. Where do we have this in Zvachim? We had it on Daf Nun Gimel and Nun Ches and Samach Gimel and Zvachim. So what do? Because Savar Aitana Kulim is Bech with Safan. Because this Tana, the second position in this Tana, Rabbi Eliezer says the entire altar was in the north. So therefore, you could be standing to the southern part of the altar and still be opposite the entrance into the sanctuary. And that's today's Daf. And Baruch Hashem, we'll pick it up again at noon today and on Shabbos Kodesh. Yes.